Alright, so I'm just going to offer a brief overview of some of the main issues that are important in understanding mental illness, particularly personality disorders, for people that don't want to read a bunch of psychological literature. Okay, so first of all, everybody has a temperament, which is your basic nature. It's your genetic endowment. You're sort of born into a particular structure. Um, People use the terms extroverted and introverted, which just means your focus of attention is either outside of you or you're in your head. But it doesn't say much about whether or not you're shy or outgoing or intelligent or anything like that. But it will have something to do with your learning style, certain behaviors, and other dispositions. The reason why it's important to understand it is because there are certain correlations between your temperament and the types of mental illness that you're vulnerable to, or other things that I just mentioned. Okay, so there's that, and let's talk about what a personality is real quick. So it's defined as a pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And they're using the word pattern there, and I hope you understand what they mean by that. But there's a certain structure to your overall personality, and this is one of the reasons why people are able to predict your behavior once they get to know you, because there's a consistent pattern in the way that you react to things or whatever. Um, so you observe patterns from what you can see, and it sort of reveals a hidden pattern in a person that you can't see. Through deduction, you kind of understand these patterns that exist in them. Anyway, so sometimes shit goes wrong, and that's when you end up with a personality disorder, which is defined as a maladaptive pattern that's deeply ingrained. So you suffer from cognitive rigidity, which means you have an inflexible way of thinking. So these personality disorders are developed in childhood. And what happens is you're a kid and you're just observing your environment, and you draw conclusions from your experiences, and you make judgments about yourself and others and the world at large. And these judgments shape later experience. So you made these judgments before you were able to make proper judgments, and these judgments are beliefs, unconscious beliefs, and they're called core beliefs. So they're statements in your unconscious mind that filter your perception of things. And when I say statements, I would argue that most psychologists believe that they're statements in your native tongue. But we'll get to that in a minute. Um, so you have these statements in your unconscious mind, and they're filtering your perceptions of things. And if these core beliefs are irrational, it's a bit like viewing the world with blurry vision. Um, and irrational beliefs almost always tend to be negative. So, so let's give an example of this. So, say there's three people that go to a store and they check out at some particular cashier with some particular cashier. So the first guy goes and the cashier pushes the change back at him, and he interprets it as she's being hostile towards him. And he has this negative core belief that um, there's something wrong with me or something like that. Um, so what happens is he interprets the event as being hostile towards himself, and he thinks to himself, what? Does she think she's better than me? And he feels anger, and he might even tell her off. Whereas another person might have the same exact experience and come draw a different conclusion. He might say, well, maybe she's working long hours. I feel sorry for her. I wouldn't want that job. And so he actually feels sympathy. Whereas a third guy, same event, he might be completely indifferent as to how she feels. This is a very simple example, but it can be that way. Sometimes just a glance at somebody with a personality disorder can cause them to get really pissed off. So, usually what happens is somebody that has negative core beliefs, they just sit dormant and then they face some form of adversity. And then these dormant core beliefs then actualize or activate, and then they shape and distort uh, people's perceptions of events. Um, and they're called cognitive distortions that these people have. Here's a list. Here's a few examples of these coming up. And what's interesting is these cognitive perceptions are just like logical fallacies. If you guys have studied formal logic, um, but just remember these are automatic ways of thinking. People with personality disorders have a very predictable pattern in the way that they think, and it's really easy to spot what somebody's problem is when you start to recognize some of these distortions. And so the bottom line is if you start off with a bad premise, you're almost always going to come up with a false conclusion. Um, but it's really hard for people with personality disorders to understand how this process works. It's like they're in this emotional washing machine, and it's really hard for them to be able to be unbiased about how they interpret events. Um, An interesting way to look at this too is if you're watching the news, most of it just looks like propaganda most of the time. Um, when somebody talks about framing something, like you hear people say, are you a half empty or half full type of guy when it comes to say like the analogy of a glass of water or the metaphor? And it's just a false dichotomy, but it's the way they frame the issue. You have to be one or the other. And you always have to be careful about those kinds of things because even with percentages, people can frame things in such a way that it seems really nice, but it's really not. Or visual distortions. If you're watching the news, and I don't want to get political, but um, there were Hillary rallies and there were Trump rallies, and the way the media would portray Hillary rallies, they'd make it, they'd put the camera really up close to her, and they would give the perception that there were a lot more people at her rallies than actually were there, and then they'd have a different angle over at Trump's rallies to make it look like he had less people than he had at his rallies. And so sometimes you have to be careful of visual distortions. And I think a lot of times when people have personality disorders, they suffer from something similar to that in their visual distortions. But with cognitive distortions, it's almost like they have this predictable pattern of thinking that doesn't allow for them to systematically arrive at the right answers. They're constantly thrown off track. So anyway, um, I'd also like to point out that this might be counterintuitive to a lot of people, but or intuitive, I don't know. But our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interconnected. If you isolate one, you can influence the other two, which is kind of cool if you think about it. An example might be exercise. If somebody decides to force themselves to go bike riding every morning, after a while they're going to adapt to it, and their feelings about it's going to change, and their behavior is going to change. They might even increase the amount that they ride. So sometimes just changing someone's behavior can help change some of the problems they have. So a final thought. This is about therapy. There's a philosophy known as Stoicism, and a guy by the name of Epictetus was one of the Stoics, and he wrote, "It's not things that disturb a man, but what he makes of them." And there's different variations to this statement. But without getting into all the details of Stoicism, a guy by the name of Albert Ellis studied Stoicism and developed a therapy to treat mental illness called REBT. It's Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy. And this was the inspiration behind CBT and DBT therapy. So if you ever look this guy up on YouTube, and he's got a couple of really old videos on there, I think he simplifies this whole. I think he makes therapy accessible to the lay public without all the complicated bullshit. So, but prior to Ellis, therapists didn't pay much attention to their patients' thoughts. They were more concerned with unconscious emotions, and that's basically what psychotherapy is. But now CBT is probably the most empirically tested and proven form of therapy there is. As for me, I've adopted Stoicism as a way of life, and I try to practice it to the best of my ability. You might want to look into it. If you have mental issues that you struggle with, it can really help you get through things in a way that maybe wasn't accessible to you before. Anyway, thanks for watching.